Okay, I want to welcome everybody. It's great to see everybody kind of signing in and saying hello. This is the Orton Family Foundation's Heart and Soul Talk on civility and civic engagement with creative tools and programs to get people engaged in their communities and talking to each other respectfully, regardless of their points of view. Today's webinar is presented in partnership with the International City County Management Association, or ICMA, the leading association of government professionals dedicated to creating and supporting thriving communities throughout the world, and Daily Yonder, a nonprofit publication devoted to covering rural America at dailyyonder.com. Welcome, I'm your host, Fran Stoddard. So in today's fractionalized, tribalized world, it seems what divides us is more often present than what unites us. Add the soundtrack of incivility that dominates discourse, and a toxic environment emerges that is fraying the fabric of our communities. Today we'll hear from several leaders committed to positive change, using creative and innovative ways to educate and engage residents with tools and ideas you can put to use right now. For today's webinar, I'd like to welcome the former head of the National Institute for Civil Discourse, Dr. Carolyn Lukensmeyer. Hi, Carolyn.
Hi, Fran. Glad to be with you.
Okay. And Emma Humphreys joins us from iCivics, an initiative to make understanding government fun and engaging. Hi, Emma.
Hi there. Thanks for having me.
And also heading up Ben Franklin Circles from the 92nd Street Y, we welcome Julie Mashak. Hi, Julie.
Hi, happy to be here.
Great. And a warm welcome to our participants today from across North America and beyond. So quickly about what the technology today, we're using this Adobe Connect platform, allowing us to share our guests, a few visuals, and take your questions. Be sure to click on that link to follow along if you aren't already with us on your computer. And please join our audio via computer or phone. We welcomed nearly 70 questions from over 720 registered for our talk today. We have combined similar questions, and we'll get to as many of them as possible after our presenters' presentations. There will also be the opportunity to ask your questions during the talk, and we'll stay alert to those coming into the participant chat box on the screen. This is also a great place to share comments, resources, and ideas to share with everybody else. If you're having any technical problems, you can dial *0 for phone issues or email communications@orton.org. The address is shown on the bottom left of your screen. So let's get on with our talk and our special guests. We begin with an overview of the topic with Dr. Carolyn Lukensmeyer, Executive Director Emerita of the National Institute for Civil Discourse, an organization that works to reduce dysfunction and incivility in our political system. As a leader in the field of deliberative democracy, she works to restore our democracy based on the vision of our founding fathers. Carolyn founded and served as president of America Speaks, a nonprofit that promoted nonpartisan initiatives to engage residents and leaders with innovative public policy tools and strategies. She's also served as a consultant to the White House and on the National Performance Review. We are thrilled to have her with us today. And go ahead, Carolyn. It's great to have you here.
Well, thank you very much, Fran. I'd like everyone who's on the call to actually also know I've been on the board of the Orton Family Foundation, which supports Heart and Soul, for 10 years. So I clearly believe deeply in this organization, and I believe deeply in the kind of community building that they have demonstrated, we have demonstrated, works so effectively for such a long period of time. The Institute, many of you on the webinar may not know the origin story of the Institute. We were created by the University of Arizona after Representative Gabby Giffords was shot in the mass shooting in Tucson, January 8, 2011, in which 6 people died and 13, including Gabby, were wounded. So we started out understanding the power of words, how much words matter, and how words can actually lead to physical violence. We collect a lot of cartoons at the Institute, and the file's getting pretty bulging at this point. One of my favorites you see on the screen in a moment. It's Civil Discourse on a gurney in the way to the emergency room, surrounded with medical personnel But as is true at that moment for anybody on their way to the emergency room, not at all clear whether or not it will survive. I'm going to spend a little bit of my time sharing with you, as Fran said, big picture. How do Americans across the country actually feel about the current state of our public and political discourse? And then I want to share some activities, not just our own, but others, that I would say are all signs of hope that we can do something about this situation. Excuse me. Weber Shandrick, which is the second largest political communications firm in the world, was a little bit prescient on this issue, and 8 years ago started doing an annual Civility in America survey. I'm going to share their 2018 data. They will be releasing their 2019 data very soon. But even as long as a year ago, 75% of us believe that incivility in America is a crisis. And this is Republicans, Democrats, Independents. 83% of us say that incivility leads to intolerance of free speech. And it's our universities that are dealing with the toughest issues around how do we actually protect First Amendment rights, but not be giving platforms for hate speech. 79% of all respondents say that incivility is leading to less political and public engagement, when exactly what we need is more. And every organization represented on this webinar, you can play a role in your community to see that people who are distraught about what's happening don't further disengage, but in fact step into the moment. The second data I want to share, the American Psychological Association has been doing Stress in America surveys for more than 20 years. Last year, for the first time ever, the fourth highest cause of stress picked by adults in the country, and their definition of stress is totally about the quality of our lives. I'm sleeping less well. I'm less productive at work. I have a fractured relationship. As you see on the screen, 57%, almost 60% of us selected the current political climate as the highest cause of stress in their lives. This has become like a virus. Yes, it started in Washington, D.C. in the hyperpartisanship of our national Senate and House of Representatives. But this is now in our families, in our communities, places that we worship, and places that we work. So that's why this moment of creating circles to restore civility and create community is more important than ever. Fran already said our purpose is to find common ground on divisive issues. We work with state legislatures all over the country. We've worked deeply in 17 states. We've reached more than 1,000 Democrat, Republican, Independent, and Green members of these state legislatures. They are taking action to reestablish trust and relationship. I'm just going to tell one quick story. It's my favorite, most current one. In the state of Maine, this January, when the new legislature came to take their seats, the President of the Senate, the Speaker of the House, both of who've gone through our work called Building Trust Through Civil Discourse, changed the seating arrangement from the traditional R's on one side, D's on the other, which is where the term across the aisle came from. Now in Maine, if you're a member of the legislature, the seating chart is RD, 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 which means people will have casual conversations. They will get to know people in the other party. We did a national network of these state legislators so that they would know one another before they showed up in Congress. When we work with the public, we're a small organization. We've chosen 4 states to deep dive: Maine, Ohio, Iowa, Arizona. You see just a smattering of the 100 organizations that are our partners. On this slide, Orton Family Foundation isn't showing, but we are a partner. Any of you who are listening who would like to partner and have us highlight what you're doing and be able to bring more of our tools into your work, please just contact me or send me a note in the chat room. I'm going to tell you 3 things that we have learned that I'm sure the other speakers and all of you will recognize immediately. What we have to do now to create these circles of conversation is set up the conditions for people to learn to listen for understanding. What in this person's life experience led them to the choice they made in who they voted for president or how they feel about the wall. What we find is that when people step back and they're not looking at their labels, you voted for Trump, I voted for Hillary, I'm for the wall, you're against the wall. If they get to know one another as people first, without exception, they discover they have more in common than they disagree about. Now, some big issues there'll be difference on, but they can actually talk and listen to one another. We have a fundamental obligation at this moment of cultural crisis in terms of how we're treating each other to see our common humanity. Let that be larger in our connection with people than our differences. Two quick other things. We've begun to see each other as enemies. If you feel differently about gay rights than I do, if you feel differently about the wall than I do, we treat each other as enemies rather than as fellow travelers trying to lead to the best America. A clue for your own self-reflection. Don't start this conversation with someone of a different point of view if you are not clear that your mind could be changed as well as theirs. If you don't have that clarity, if that's not real, then you are part of the problem, not part of the solution. Two things I just want to tell you very quickly the Institute is doing to take this work to scale. We know millions of people are shifting how they're trying to bring together people in their communities. Craft beer in conversations, makeshift coffee houses, just ordinary people just doing this because they know how important it is. But we're all, every day, bombarded with millions of social media messages and tweets actually taking us into the negative. So the two things we're doing to scale. We started a Civility TV series called Divided We Fall. The first element that you'll hear about this is in public radio next Friday, where two people who participated in this process, an African-American woman from Chicago and a white gentleman from Chicago who had this experience, understood that they have more in common than they have different. We hope you will listen and join us. Two other comments before I close out. We've started something called Common Sense American. You can go to the website www.commonsenseamerican.org and you can express your opinion on key policy issues and discover that there's less difference amongst Americans than you think. All of this data will be taken into Congress. So what can you do? Sign a civility pledge, become a member of Common Sense American. I think I've probably run out of my time, Fran, so this slide will be in your packet for the future.
Fabulous.
Never doubt that a small group of citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing it ever has, but it's going to take millions of the small circles, and that's why we're holding this webinar. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much, Carolyn, and we'll be back to you, of course, when we get to the Q&A period. Very, very hopeful and interesting information. Thank you. So we'll move on to Emma Humphreys. She is the Chief Education Officer at iCivics, an educational nonprofit dedicated to reinvigorating civic learning through interactive and engaging learning resources, including online games. Emma serves as the organization's pedagogical expert, leads the curriculum team, and supports teachers in deepening their levels of engagement with iCivics products so they can provide transformative classroom experiences for young citizens, and I think for older folks too now. So Emma, go ahead. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, thanks so much, Fran, and thank you, Carolyn. That was a great introduction to the issue and to some great solutions. And I think I sort of represent the long game here. I represent an organization that's working to build that foundation upon which Carolyn's organization's efforts and the efforts of a lot of other organizations can really be successful, and that's by improving civic education across the land. So let me see here to advance my slides. Brilliant. Okay, so yeah, iCivics, what we're known as and what teachers, especially and their students, know us as, is a digital civic education platform. We were founded by Justice Sandra Day O'Connor in 2009 to ensure that every student in America, and we take that very seriously, every student has access to high quality, engaging, and effective civic materials. And the way she framed this 10 years ago was by reminding us that the practice of democracy is not passed down through the gene pool. We actually have to teach it, and students have to learn it each and every generation. We can't skip any generations, even though we sort of have done that since the 1950s. I think today, if you were to ask her in sort of this current climate, this more divisive climate in which we find ourselves, she would add a couple little revisions, a couple little copy edits to this statement to say that the practice of democracy and civil dialogue is not passed down to the gene pool. We have to teach these, and I think more importantly, provide students opportunities to practice these skills and demonstrate this knowledge. And the best place to do that, of course, is the classroom. As many of you know, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor has retired, fully retired from public life. We're very fortunate in that Justice Sonia Sotomayor has taken up the mantle and has joined the board of iCivics and is a wonderful advocate for us and for our mission. And she was on Matter of Fact with Soledad O'Brien recently, and I think a lot of you might have seen her on CBS Sunday Morning as well. But she had this really powerful quote that I'd like to highlight here. And that is, I'm sorry, I missed a step here. If you look at the history of the decline of social studies in schools across the country, you will start noticing the rise of partisanship and the decrease in civic participation. The two are directly correlated. And I think that also incorporates, of course, this idea of civility and knowing how to talk to one another. For us, this is very clear what this means. It means that if we want to live in a healthy and vibrant democratic republic, and I think all of us do, then we must teach the social studies. This seems really obvious, and it's probably obvious to most people on the call. I sure hope it's more obvious across the land. But as many of us know, we really truly stopped teaching the social studies. A lot of folks point to 1957, the launching of Sputnik, sort of made us all lose our minds and think, oh my goodness, we're losing this. We have to stop everything, teach science, technology, engineering, and math. And consequently, social studies took a back seat. And so we truly have generations of students who have not been taught civics. So here's what we're doing to fix that. We are, and by we I mean iCivics, is leading a coalition of 80 organizations and growing who are leading this charge to restore the civic mission of schools. We're doing this by bringing everyone together, by trying to come up with a common set of measures, by trying to come up with a repository of best practices, and ultimately encouraging more and more states to pass robust civic education so that students are taking more civic education starting in the younger grades and taking more of it, not just little pieces here and there where we can fit it in. So the Civics Now movement is a big part of this effort to make sure that more students have access to more and better civic education. The other part of the iCivics solution, and it's sort of our original mission and our original purpose, is this digital platform to which I referred earlier. So iCivics provides fully free over 200 resources for teaching students about American government, American politics, controversial issues discussion, all the skills and knowledge and dispositions of civics. Again, this is all free, and this is all online at www.icivics.org. Whether you are a student, a teacher, a parent, a concerned member of the community, this tool is yours to access and to use. So I certainly encourage you to do so. And I want to just make a few comments about what our teachers say. So even though we don't exist purely to promote civil discussion or civil dialogue, we know that our resources promote precisely that. And so every year we survey our teachers and we ask them these questions. You know, what tangible impact have you noticed in your classroom? And I know this is really hard to read. It's really small, but increased interest surrounding current political events. 40% of teachers referred to that. And then to take that a step further, we also see that it inspires discussions at home. So almost the majority of teachers saying yes, their kids come back and tell them that they play iCivics games or they engage in iCivics lesson plans and they have these discussions in class and then they bring those discussions back home. My last thing to offer you is a new initiative. As Fran said, it's not just for students, it's also for adults, and we really want to encourage that kind of intergenerational play. So we have a new initiative called Democracy at Play. We have a landing page devoted to that. You see the URL there on your screen. So I encourage you to check that out. Kristen Chaprone is our project lead. She's wonderful. She's on this webinar right now. If you have any questions about democracy at play or anything else I've talked about, please reach out to Kristen, and she'll make sure that your inquiry is directed to the right place. Everyone's heard it. It's starting to sound a bit cliche, at least for me, but everyone knows that, when Ben Franklin left the Constitutional Convention, he was asked what he and the other framers had created, what they had wrought, and his famous answer, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." We need to work really hard to keep it. iCivics represents that long game of making sure that students are educated for their important role in helping us to keep our democratic republic. Thank you.
Fabulous, Emma. Thank you so much. And thank you for bringing up Ben Franklin, because it's a beautiful bridge to all of this. It's very exciting what you're doing, very, very fun. We'll move on to Julie Mashak. She is the Director of Global Network and Programs for the Belfer Center for Innovation and Social Impact at the 92nd Street Y in New York City. Julie oversees several of the center's civic initiatives that bring programs to new audiences and engage communities around the world. In 2016, she helped launch and has since led Ben Franklin Circles, a national network of over 300 grassroots groups, reviving Ben Franklin's Club for Mutual Improvement. In addition, Julie manages major partnerships, strategy, press, and funding for the Belfer Center programs that further civic and civil dialogue and foster community building in the face of increased isolation and polarization. Julie, it's great to have you with us. Why don't you do your present, and then we'll all have a lively discussion after. Go ahead, Julie.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here, and what a perfect setup. Thank you, Emma, for ending us on Ben Franklin. It's a perfect place for me to begin. So I'm joining you from the 92nd Street Y in New York City, and for those of you who don't know, the 92nd Street Y is a over 140-year-old cultural and community center that is really embedded in the civic life of New York City. So you can come to the Y at any stage in life, from any background, and find programming that's geared at helping you improve your life and helping you be part of the community. So this can be everything from our senior programs for 65 and older New Yorkers to brand new babies that come with their parents as part of our parenting classes. So my job at the Y is really geared at taking the mission of the Y out into the world. So to take some of these core values that the Y stands by, things like education, self-improvement, community engagement, civic dialogue, and lifelong learning, and to give people the tools outside of our building, in many cases way outside of New York City, to be able to live this mission in their own life. So the Ben Franklin Circles were started with that goal in mind. At its core, we were very interested in providing people, wherever they were, with the tools to convene conversations in their community and to ask two very simple but profound questions. How can we improve ourselves? And together, how can we improve the world? We began running the circles in early 2016 in a climate very different than the one we're living in post-election. But since that date, we have now launched over 300 circles around the country. And these circles are small groups of people that are getting together, and they're meeting in their living rooms, they're meeting in the rooms of a public library, some are meeting in high schools. We even have one that meets in a national state park at Red Rocks National Park in Sedona. The idea for this project actually came from something that Franklin did. He started a club that he called, as Fran mentioned, a Club for Mutual Improvement. Or in some cases, this club is also called the Junto. Excuse me, one of my slides skip. So the idea actually came, excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm having trouble with my slide here, if I could just have 1 second. The idea came from something that Franklin actually wrote about in his autobiography. He wrote about what he called his Club for Mutual Improvement. And what Franklin did was he gathered peers once a week at a local pub for conversations that were wide-ranging in nature, but were essentially about the question of what it means to live a good life and what it means to be a good citizen. Franklin's group got together and asked one another questions like, who are people in the community we need to support? What is an unjust policy we need to be working to remedy? Who is someone that we need to champion in the community? Even occasionally, what's the best book that we should all be reading? At the core of these conversations was an emphasis on 13 civic virtues. These were qualities like justice and order, moderation, and humility. And for each of these virtues, Franklin wrote a simple but pretty profound short definition. At the 92nd Street Y, we were intrigued by this club, and we thought, let's do an experiment. Let's run one of these and see what we learned. So we created a model that doesn't exactly mirror what Franklin did, but was very much inspired by his mission. So we gathered a small group of 12 people, and we said, for 13 months, we want to meet once a month, and we want to use as our jumping off point one of Franklin's civic virtues as a conversation prompt. And we want to ask, what does this virtue mean in our own lives, and how can we better put it to use in the world? Out of that conversation, among this original pilot group of 12, we formed so many new and interesting relationships. We created a support network around people that didn't know each other before. We had these amazing conversations about what is the idea of justice, and what does that mean as an individual to practice justice? What does it mean to live a just life? Or one of the virtues is silence. So conversations about what does silence really mean in our currently very fast-paced digital world, and also is that a value we hold dear as a community, and how can we better practice it, and what might the practice of that virtue do to our personal and professional lives? So out of that amazing experience, we thought, why limit this to the why? Let's build the tools and resources so that anyone, anywhere, could hold one of these Ben Franklin circles. And so we created a very loose toolkit based on what we did, and we laid out very clearly in a series of steps what a Ben Franklin circle could look like. So we said, start by gathering a group of 10 to 12. I personally run one of these just for the public in New York City. It's between 7 to 10 people, so some groups may be smaller, some groups may be bigger. We suggested commit to doing this as a regular practice and meet once a month, talk about the virtue, read Franklin's definition, have about 40 minutes of conversation, and then at the end of the conversation, commit to taking this virtue out into the world and living it in your daily life. When you come back the following month, we ask the group, so how did it go? And what this does is provide these basic touch points that people can be a part of, a support network to deal with issues that they're dealing with in their own life, and also a platform for people to think, how is this group that is sharing this, how can we become a platform for change larger in the community outside? So what does Ben Franklin Circles have to do with civility? And how does this relate to our current state of polarization? Most basically, what these circles provide is a touch point for communities simply to connect their members with one another. Neighbors meet each other through these circles. We actually recently did a survey of our existing circle hosts and found that 2 people that lived right across the street from each other for over 10 years only met because they attended one of these circles. We can't underestimate how important it is to be a tool for forming those kind of relationships. Through these conversations, we found that people discover things they have in common, and in its most basic form, they just practice the art of conversation, face-to-face, learning to listen, hearing different perspectives, and connecting with people they might otherwise know. Also, just a note on the topics, framing these conversations around Franklin's virtues, we find that because we're not starting at a hot-button issue topic, we are able to kind of loosen some of those preconceptions that people might come to the conversation. So beginning with something like justice as opposed to beginning with something like educational reform, which of course there's so much value in those conversations. But what we found is that it's a different lens, and it takes people outside of their day-to-day thinking in a way that almost makes them more willing to listen, to communicate, and to in some ways double down less on the opinions they might have come into. And that's not to say that any of those conversations geared at, bridging divides and directly dealing with current events is not valuable, we see this as a tool that can live side by side with that and just offer a different lens for conversation. So one thing I did want to mention quickly was also the idea that this can be a tool for bridging divides. At its core, this is about bringing people together, but we do have several circles that are made up of politically diverse viewpoints. In fact, I just got a note recently from one of our circle members in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, who shared the following. She said, "We use our circles to have several great debates between our members, mostly due to the fact that our members are socialist and libertarian among its members. Although the debates can get passionate, they are always respectful. The members have gained insight not only into the beliefs that someone on the opposite end of the spectrum holds, but why they have those beliefs and the reasoning behind them. We generally enjoy seeing each other after the discussions, bid each other have a great evening, and greet one another sincerely the next time we convene." I'm also on this slide showing some of the other reasons that people have started circles, from everything from just building a new community in their lives to specifically seeking out a forum where people can talk about different values than their own. I also just quickly, before I wrap up, wanted to mention one other element that I think is particularly important to this project. As we think about polarization and a lack of civility, I think at its core is something that is a growing trend that we see in American culture, and that's the idea of isolation, that nearly half of Americans now report feelings of loneliness and disconnection from others. And this isolation, in some ways, is a foundation that can lead to what we're seeing with the incivility, the polarization, as fewer people actually connect face-to-face. There's less of those civic bonds that people experience as being part of a community. And so my hope with projects like the Ben Franklin Circles and all of the other projects currently being talked about on the webinar is that we can be a bit of an anecdote, not just for civility and polarization, but also just to address that core need for people to have regular secular gatherings. I was so struck by Carolyn's example in her presentation about by simply mixing up the chairs and having a social opportunity to speak to someone that you would otherwise be seated across the room from, just inspires a little bit of that personal connection and that civics glue. So I would encourage anyone who is interested in starting a Ben Franklin Circle to visit our website. Thank you so much for sharing the toolkit in the chat box. And if you're interested in starting one or simply learning more, please be in touch. We have toolkits, regular webinars, onboarding calls, and ongoing coaching from the 92nd Street Y that's provided to anyone wherever you are and whatever your starting point is to help launch these circles around the country. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, Julie. Thank you so much. It gives me a lot of hope. And there are the Ben Franklin circles. People are doing interesting dinners. There are some hopeful stories among all the stories we hear where it's not so peaceful. So I'm going to get to your questions. And we're doing this kind of by themes. Many people, probably the most that came in, were people being concerned about dealing with disruptors. So, for example, from Cleveland, Ohio, advice on best ways to disarm a disruptor who's been uncivil, using racist stereotypes, ridiculing the presenter. From Florida, concerned about how to deal with people that are using values and beliefs versus facts. In Connecticut, people at the podium misstating facts. People in Maine concerned about conspiracy theories that abound, and how do you deal with that? Is there a way to leave national politics at the door? What about people that are naysaying, being rude online and social media? I'm going to go back to Carolyn for this one first. So when there is a disruptor in the room, and this happens in many public forums, how do you begin, what kind of advice do you give people to help with someone who's really disrupting any kind of discussion?
Well, Fran, I'm going to back up all the way to ask to describe how is the structure of the room set up. Traditionally, many of our public meetings have whoever's running it at a table in the front or on a platform. Then it's auditorium style with a couple of microphones in the aisles. This is a structure that encourages disruption. This is a structure that reduces meaningful connection amongst the people who are gathered to hear whatever the topic is. So one of the things to think about, and in all the meetings we do, we set the room up in round tables with 8 to 10 people at a table, every table having its own facilitator, so that much of the conversation goes on between a smaller group of people rather than 100 people in the room all focusing on 4 or 5 on a stage, and then the disruption happens pretty easily. So think about structure. But let's say that in terms of some of you, whether it's Cleveland or Florida or Connecticut or Maine, that wasn't the issue. The steps that we take when we're dealing with someone who's disrupting is, in fact, for the moment, actually giving them our attention. To say, you know, this is an evening in which we've all come together. You're choosing to jump ahead in the queue or whatever's the right neutral description. You're not calling them a disruptor. You're not doing any judgment. So I'm going to give you the floor for a moment. I would, you know, say what it is you'd really like to say. And at the end of that time, what we expect is that other people will have a chance to re-engage and respond. Now again, disruption takes on all levels of how serious it is. And goodness knows, ever since the 2016 presidential election, we're looking at images on our screens, whatever device we're using, on a pretty regular basis where, in fact, the disruption takes on a physical element, where the person is not only verbally disruptive, but is also physically disruptive. If you're in a context where you think that is a possibility, then we really encourage people to have people stationed around the room whose job it is to actually be paying attention if we're crossing a line from words to physicality, excuse me, and at the appropriate moment to really escort that person from the room. But here's the fundamental principle I'd start with. Unless someone is already emotionally out of control, disrupting is just a deeper, deeper expression of the pain of not being heard. So your first step is to create the environment where this person knows they have been heard. They have been spoken, they've been responded to personally, and now we're going to open it for other people to speak and be heard. I hope giving that range is helpful.
Great. Thank you so much, Carolyn. Absolutely. And it takes me to the next major theme that was covered that people wanted to talk about. We're really bringing in diverse groups and making sure that they're heard. From Minnesota, how do you bring in people that are not culturally competent or fearful of difference and in polarization? From Massachusetts, how do you engage under-resourced residents who are systematically isolated from the process? From Washington State, how do you engage underrepresented groups? From New York, how do we include faith communities? From Massachusetts, you know, how do you make sure that the voices that are contrary to their shouting neighbors that can be heard? So I'm going to go to Julie first about this, because somebody even wrote in you know, are there more liberals and conservatives that do those circles? But how do you make sure that you bring in people that are shy or not heard or underrepresented or under-resourced? How do you make sure that those people are part of the conversations, Julie?
Well, that's a great question, and thank you. I do want to say that I think partially this project is aided by the idea of sort of being based on something that that Franklin did, that it doesn't overtly, you know, it's much more positioned as sort of a philosophical conversation that I think appeals to people because, you know, there's something a little bit sort of intriguing about what is this sort of unfamiliar thing that I didn't realize Ben Franklin did. There's a little bit of sort of curiosity factor that I think people, you know, aren't quite sure. I think it really appeals to people across the aisle that are curious about having these conversations about values. And I talk about that from the experience of having run one of these with the Brooklyn Public Library. And granted, Brooklyn may be considered sort of a kind of blue city in a blue area. But we actually, by advertising this through a public library project, received sort of one of our most politically diverse groups there, which I think partially people were drawn in by a couple different things. One was the idea of having a values-based as opposed to an issues-based conversation, so coming because they would like to talk about the idea of civic virtue, and also, you know, the idea of this being something that didn't scream overtly of having a political undertone. So I think part of that both kind of led to being able to attract different and new audiences. And then in terms of bringing in new communities, we think of this is at the 92nd Street Y, what we're providing is the tool for people to be able to use. So to be able to take the idea of the circle and use it in different environments. And I think we've had a lot of success. For instance, we work with a group called United Citizen Power. That's a network of grassroots organizers, very interested in bringing people together from various backgrounds. They hold some of our most diverse circles. And for them, it's a community engagement tool. So they go out and they canvass and they talk to people, and then they say, you know what, come to one of these circles and you'll get to know each other better. So they, you know, we might not be able to, from kind of distributing the tools, you know, sort of say, well, from New York, we're able to assemble a, you know, incredibly diverse group in X area. But what we have been able to do is sort of dig deeper with partnerships in the community that have that as the goal, and to work with them and say, how can the circles be a tool that can further that? And I think to that sense, the idea of this being something that can be sort of the social environment, the civic glue piece of the work that you're doing otherwise, I think really helps kind of, you know, bring in some of those other members that might not naturally show up at a circle.
Great. Yeah, I think certainly partnerships, libraries, somebody wanted to know how libraries could be a part of that. I think libraries are doing amazing things and being a safe place for people to gather from all backgrounds.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. I'd like to go to civics education, of course, was another question a lot of people had. So for Emma, some of the questions that came in were, when's the appropriate age to begin teaching civics? And then a lot of interest in how do you really promote parents' involvement and family discussions, and where to get resources, and how to best teach civic engagement. So you're on, Emma, to talk about, you know, when do you start teaching this stuff, and how do you really engage the whole family unit?
As early as possible, of course. Say beginning in even preschool and kindergarten, first grade, talking about community and circles of influence that these kids have, which might be really small early on, classroom, family, friends, and then of course expand as they get older. So like most topics, really, civics is appropriate for young students. It's just, of course, a matter of how you present it and what fashion. And iCivics is working to sort of vertically expand so that we're providing more resources for elementary school. But that can't be overstated. When we've seen this sort of epic decline in civic education, we've seen it the most at the elementary level, where the focus is really solely on literacy and math. And even in sort of more privileged school settings, you see a real lack of civic education. It's sort of fit in where you can, and if you can fit it in while you're teaching reading, even better, and that's a mistake. We need to sort of restore civics to its rightful public mission for our schools. In terms of how to bring that conversation home, encourage family discussion, you know, the best way to do that is to just have it happening in the classroom. If we're teaching it in the classroom, the students are more likely to be engaged and to take those conversations home with them. Of course, you can make assignments out of this, and you can encourage students to go home and play a game with their parents. One of the best examples that we see is with our game, Win the White House. It teaches the process of the presidential election, which, as we all know, is very complicated in the United States. And I don't have to tell you that many adults struggle to understand the electoral college system and how that works. So it's really cool. And the kids go home, they play the game at school because they were told to, and then they go home and they play it because they want to. And the parents say, hey, what are you doing? Oh, I'm learning about the electoral college. Oh, can I play? Or let me watch. And so we yield a lot of comments from parents, from teachers to that effect. So, civics, there are certainly really helpful, really strong instructional techniques for teaching it. Of course, we believe classroom discussion, game-based learning, or simulations are two of the most powerful. But sometimes just simply introducing it as a topic in school is enough to ignite those conversations at home.
Great. Thank you so much, Emma.
Underline the importance,
go ahead.
Just to underline the importance of what Julie's talking about, many of us remember what people eventually researched to find out that one of the biggest things that created adults stopping smoking was their children coming home from school,
That's right,
where they had been educated on the impact of smoking and cancer, and actually teaching, imploring their parents to stop smoking. So the link that Julie's making, we know it works.
That's right. That's a great point.
Emma, are you feeling that educators are more eager
Emma,
to
I'm
get
sorry.
involved?
I apologize. Of course I meant Emma.
That's okay, Carolyn. We knew what you meant. Fran, I'm sorry. Could you repeat your question?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you're feeling an urgency on the part of educators more now to get involved in civics. I mean, are people calling you up? Is your phone ringing often?
It is, yeah. So, I referred to Sputnik in 1957 in my earlier comments, and a lot of folks have referred to the 2016 presidential election as a Sputnik moment for civics, and that it sort of inspired this feeling of uncertainty across the country, on both sides of the aisle, across the ideological spectrum, folks feeling a little uncertain about the future of our democratic republic and feeling this urgency. So that's sort of at the public writ large, but in terms of educators and teachers specifically, it used to be, all right, kids, come in, we're going to talk about the election, we're going to talk about controversial issues. Now the kids are meeting the teacher at the door saying, are we going to talk about this today? We want to talk about this today. And so we think it's important to make sure that we have those resources readily available so that teachers can feel confident and comfortable and safe in allowing those discussions to take place. Because without going down that whole pathway, it can be sort of a risky move for teachers to allow controversial issues discussion in the classroom. And now just sort of teaching politics and teaching government feels like teaching a controversial issue.
So interesting. Another
Fran?
very interesting, yes, go ahead, Carolyn. And then
Fran, in the chat room, someone named Kitty mentioned that back to the disruption question, that disruption can sometimes be a door into a positive innovation. I just want to affirm that's definitely true. Most of the questions that were asked were clearly desirous of dealing with negative disruption. But and when you respond and give the person space to speak, very often if you follow the intent of their message, there is a new and different perspective they're bringing in, which you then as the leader, the facilitator, can in fact support, which will remove the disruption and put a new idea on the table. So I just want to say, Kitty, you're definitely right. It can be made a positive.
And to that point, another set of questions that came in was really understanding what civility means now, that the term is often used against people, to target people if they're speaking up or if they're angry. People are saying, why don't you be more civil, or they're just so uncivilized. Is this tone policing? Are there marginalized groups that are being asked to be nicer? What's that dark side that doesn't seem to allow for anger and emotions for people whose voices have been stifled for so long? People from Kansas and Maine and Connecticut are all interested in how can those people find a place to really express themselves and not feel they're being shut down. So Carolyn, just follow up on that train.
Well, I'm sure no one on this webinar will be surprised that the moment that this became really critical for our organization was the policy of the administration to separate children from families at the border. The level of moral outrage in this country was extraordinary. And many people at that point really said civility is passé, civility is a problem. We have to respond differently to this. It took some time for us to really think through how to respond to that, and we did it by going back to our founding of the nation once again. not many people know this, but in the Constitutional Convention, the concept of civility was actually discussed. And it was actually discussed as a democratic value that is absolutely necessary in a democratic society. Right side by side, while this discussion is going on, obviously we're a nation that was born in protest. A little Tea Party a little further north in Boston. It actually led to a revolution. So what I think people have to understand, in our country, there has to, at the same time, be room for civility and room for protest. And even when you move to protest, there's an entire range of how to protest that stays in the bounds of civility and respect. Martin Luther King, probably the most respected movement leader in any of our lifetimes. Never once did he cross the line of leaving civility in his protest. Now, many other people who were in the civil rights movement did that, and thank goodness they did it, because otherwise we wouldn't have made the progress we did. Where it's very tough today, that we deal with on a for certain weekly basis, African American people who have had the experience not just in the 50s and 60s, but in Chicago, in Ferguson, of being told by white people that they need to behave in a certain way in order to be heard. That is a misuse of the invocation of the concept of civility. And those of us who understand the difference need to speak up and say so. The second group in the country that is having the toughest time with this at the moment are our Muslim brothers and sisters. This is where you talked about tone policing. The place we've heard this most frequently is on campuses when a speaker comes in who's definitely doing hate speech relative to Muslim religion and the Muslim people, identifying them all as terrorists, and Muslim students want to protest. And Muslim students want to protest in a way that their voices are disruptive. And university administrations are having to really work through how do we have space for both without Muslim students feeling like they have been tone policed. I'm going to share one last thing that I have found incredibly useful, and I hope lots of you will find useful. You know, words change over time, and the context influences what the word means. In Western society, it's real that civility has come to mean to most people manners and politeness. Look it up in the dictionary. That's the first two words you'll hear. When I took this position and was challenged constantly, what is civility anyway? Aren't you just telling me to be nice? I decided to really look up the etiology of the word. And I invite everybody in this call just to take what I share with you and use, or look it up yourselves. The word civility actually comes from the 14th century, the 1300s, in the country of France, at a time in which they were in one of the many serious disruptions on the continent during that century. And the actual meaning of the word civility at its root is the duties and responsibilities of a citizen. That puts a whole new cast on why it really matters for all of us to step up at this point and be real role models for the social norms of civility and respect. We already all know that in the next 2 years, this is just going to get worse. This isn't going to get better in Washington, D.C. So if we're going to start to bring back, it is the Ben Franklin circles, it is makeshift coffee houses, it is iCivics, it is millions of us committing to revive the social norms of civility and respect in our own circles of influence.
Great. Thank you, Carolyn. To move into that, when there is a conversation, someone from Oregon wanted to know, I don't want to walk away from a conversation, but how do you steer it in a positive direction? From Vermont, tools to make neighborhood meetings more positive and collaborative. From Alabama, are there ways to introduce nonpartisan issues to get support from people across the spectrum on nonpartisan issues. So Julie, a little bit about, do you use facilitators? Are they trained? How do you continue to move a conversation into a positive direction?
I think that's a great question, and just in response to the sort of issue of nonpartisanship, I noticed there was a comment in the chat box from Greg about is this, maybe the circles might be a way to sort of lay a foundation of trust, and then you can move on to more difficult conversations. And I just wanted to kind of applaud that, because that is, sort of what we're hoping, is that through the lens of these larger core values, that people are able to kind of connect around some of those sort of fundamental pieces of our day-to-day lives, and then maybe from there, when there are differences that arise around very hot button issues, they've gotten to know each other through the lens of talking about some of these bigger issues like silence and order and moderation. Even cleanliness is one of them, and it's fascinating because so much of that is a personal take on what this means, but to be able to talk about things from a personal perspective, I think is sort of where we get at that sort of level of trust. I constantly, working with our facilitator in New York, in one of our conversations that kind of went a little bit back off track, what she says is, bring it back to the personal. When these conversations turn into, I wish someone practiced this virtue in this way, we say, that's not, what does it mean to you? When you go through your day-to-day life, what does it mean when someone is unjust to you? What does that feel like? And I think grounding it in that and grounding it in the storytelling of personal experience helps people kind of say, oh, I understand a little bit more about why you might approach that topic in this way, because you've been able to share something very personal. As people are willing to. We never pressure people to share things in our group that they don't want to, but it is a window to allow people to kind of talk about where their beliefs come from, to get back to that sort of core interpretation of values, which I find very helpful and powerful, and in some ways becomes the foundation that, then when you say, oh, well, I believe this about this, current events issue or this hot button topic, you have a little bit more of the foundation for how they got there.
Well, thank you very much. We're already almost through with our hour. So I just want to say there are a lot of questions about local leadership and wishing that, people would lose their distrust of local leadership, and or that local leadership would listen to something like this and have a better sense of how to make sure to include everybody. Because we just have a few minutes left, I'd like to just hear from each of you, maybe just closing thoughts on steps participants can take even in the next week to restore and create more civil communities. Like what are some steps they can take right away? And we haven't heard from Emma for a minute, so I'm gonna let you do your conclusion first. Go ahead, Emma.
Yeah, I'll just say I know it's tricky, and I know there's all sorts of reasons not to have these conversations, but we absolutely need to be having them. I've heard many times that one doesn't talk about sex, politics, or religion in polite company, to which I always respond, then what are we supposed to talk about? Those are the most interesting topics of conversation. And if we practice them, at younger ages, they're easier to have. And if I can just say, I grew up in South Florida, a blue area. We used to joke, we used to call our social studies department the socialist studies department. That's how liberal they were. And for my first teaching job out of college, I taught in Middleburg in Clay County, Florida, much more red. And I taught controversial issues every day. So if a first-year, 23-year-old teacher, this was a while ago, from South Florida could teach in Middleburg, Florida, and teach controversial issues, then any teacher can, and any adult can have reasonable, civil discussions around these hard topics.
Thank you so much, Emma. And Julie, what would you say? What can people do, like just next week, get started on more civil conversations, creating civil communities?
Sure. I mean, I think, one, I would encourage anybody who's interested in the model of the Ben Franklin Circles to please visit the website, reach out directly. As I mentioned, we'll get you connected with everything you need to get started. And to also not be deterred in any way that this is a longer running project. You could just do one. You could start there. You could have these conversations with your neighbor, invite them over for a drink or a dinner, and pick one of these kind of value-based conversations to get started. And then also, I think for me, one thing coming out of the practice of the circles, one of the virtues is silence. And my commitment when we did silence was, I'm going to listen a full beat before I respond to somebody. And just even making that a daily sort of meditative practice, I just realized I was like, oh my gosh, I constantly interrupt people. I constantly speak over others. And that in its way might seem simple, but at the core is, kind of gets at some of these issues around civility.
Awesome, Julie. Passionate yet very respectful all the time. Carolyn, I'm giving you the last word.
Well, I've been trying to type this in the chat room, but all of the tools and resources that we've created to do exactly what you're asking are readily available on a website, www.revivecivility.org. For some reason, it won't let me type it in. But I would just, Arthur Brooks recently published a book in which he shared a piece of data that I found really just underlining how serious this is in our country. From a recent research study, 1 in 6 Americans say they have a fractured relationship because of the state of politics and our political and public discourse. 1 in 6 of us say we have a fractured relationship. So I think the importance of doing this is huge. And all I would say is think about who that person is in your life. And just on your own, step back and ask yourself, what's the risk if I were to initiate a conversation for the two of us to talk about what's happened? And what's the reward if I were to do it and it would be successful? And then set up the ground rule. We're going to talk, but we're going to listen only to understand. We're not going to rebut anything the other one says. At the end of this conversation, the only goal is to learn what in my life has brought me to feel the way I feel, and what in your life has brought you to feel the way you feel. And one clue, when you have that conversation, if it's a fractured relationship, something the other person said is going to trigger you, is going to make you want to say, that's not factual, or whatever. 2 things to do when that moment happens that will keep this open for understanding. Take a deep breath, and ask a question. That will continue the process of understanding one another. We have to do this for the quality of our own lives and for the quality of our democracy.
Thank you so much, Carolyn, for everything that you do and for joining us today. And thank you also to Emma Humphreys from iCivics and Julie Mashak from the Ben Franklin Circles and the 92nd Street Y. You're all fabulous. Thank you for a wonderful, wonderful call. So just closing out, I also want to thank the Orton Family Foundation who makes these sessions possible, and for our participants today, all the questions you sent in, and our partners on this webinar, the International City County Management Association and Daily Yonder, a nonprofit publication focused on rural America at dailyyonder.com. We encourage you to please take a moment to fill out the short survey provided as a link on your screen. A recording of this webinar will be sent around to all our registrants and will be posted to our website, orton.org, in the next few days for anybody that you think could benefit from listening to it. And stay tuned for the future. Please join us on our next free webinar on May 2nd. Our focus is what rural communities are doing to combat the opiate crisis. You'll find the link to register for this event on your screen as well. Thank you all for joining us today, and for the Orton Family Foundation, I'm Fran Stoddard. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.